So Claudius recounts the story, really quick to point out that the Jews were wanting to kill Paul, and he conveniently neglected to write about his own binding of Paul as a Roman citizen without a trial. You see, essentially Claudius Lysias was trying to get rid of Paul, this hot potato. It's always a human nature, our nature, to make ourselves look better than we really deserve. And that's what Claudius does. He leaves out the part that makes him look bad, and he emphasizes what the Jews were doing and paints his own self in a much better light. It's very rare to find someone who will tell their full involvement in something that is perceived as bad, or that they might get in trouble if the total truth was known. I like the story of my own son Timmy when he was little. Daddy, Nicole hit me. I said, well, son, why did Nicole hit you? And he says, well, because I was chewing gum. And I said, well, you're not chewing gum now. What did you do with it? He said, nothing. I threw it away. So then when I got Nicole, I'm assuming she was mad because he didn't give her gum, but I said, Nicole, why did you hit Timmy? And she said, because he threw gum in my hair. So yes, Timmy threw it away all right, but he threw it away into her hair, hence he got punched. So he left out that one part of his story. He wanted to make Nicole look bad, but not himself. It was a lot easier, let me tell you, getting the truth out of Timmy than it was to get the gum out of Nicole's hair. But this letter essentially recounts the story as Claudius is letting the Caesar know that what had happened, and without telling him what he indeed did do to Paul. So let's continue to read in verse 31. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from, and when he had understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. This was about a 25-mile-ish journey, and mostly through Jewish settlements. It was probably the most dangerous part of the trip, though there wasn't much of a chance that these 40 were going to fulfill their vow against nearly 500 Roman soldiers who were guarding Paul. But we don't know what became of those men or their vow. And perhaps because Scripture is silent, we would do well to maybe be silent as well on those that God might deal with in our lives who come against us. You know, may the Lord open your eyes to see that God has many more who stand with you than the enemy has who stands against you. And let the Lord deal with them. And then don't rejoice if they don't fulfill their vows. Don't rejoice if something happens to them. Just let it go and let the Lord. You know, there's nothing that we need to fear. Not even death itself has the final power over us. Nothing can get through God's battle lines that he doesn't allow to come in. So if you feel like Satan has kind of influence over someone in your life, and they're bringing you great harm, I really suggest that you ask God to open your eyes to the forces of angels that he has on your side. And when you do this, I want you to consider perhaps even how the story ended with Elijah and how he dealt with this army that had come out against him. Let's go back to 2 Kings chapter 6, and let's read the rest of the story to see this wonderful way that Elijah dealt with his enemy, who was unable to come against him because of how God protected him. So let's look at verse 18 of chapter 6. So when the Syrians came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people, I pray, with blindness. And he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. Now you might think right there, well, that's a good prayer. I'll start praying that God makes my enemies blind. No. Listen to the motivation of Elisha and what he does afterwards. And then Elisha said to them, this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. So it was, when they had come to Samaria, that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and they were inside Samaria. Now when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elijah, My father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? But he answered, You shall not kill them. Would you kill those whom you have taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set food and water before them, that they may eat and drink, and go back to their master. And then he prepared a great feast for them. And after they ate and drank, he sent them away, and they went to their master. So the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land of Israel. Don't miss this. Elisha asked the Lord to make these men blind. Once they were blind, he led them to Samaria. So as they get into Samaria, they're surrounded now by the king of Israel. And when he opens their eyes, they see, we're trapped. We're done for. There's nothing we can do. And the king of Samaria, or of Israel, knows it. He's like, let's pounce on them. Let's wipe them out. Here's our chance to take care of your enemies, Elijah. And Elijah says, whoa, wait a minute. Would you do this to those you have taken captive? We need to show them mercy. So I want you to feed them. Well, the king of Israel was so blessed by Elisha's counsel that it says he made a great feast. And he fed these soldiers, and he sent them back to the Syrian king. When he did this, showed them such kindness, the Syrians never again attacked Israel and stopped harassing their borders. This is why it's important that we also love our enemies as Jesus told us to, and that we heap kindness upon them and not retribution or anger, and not worry about when God delivers us from them, not then hope that God then smites them or brings some calamity to them. No, let's just be thankful that the Lord delivered us, that he loves those who are coming against us, and ask the Lord to move in their lives. And let's even feed them and hopefully befriend them. But if not, at least perhaps our kindness will keep them from continuing to harass us. Let us open our eyes. Lord, help us open our eyes to who our true enemies are. Listen, none of you have earthly enemies. Remember, it says that they came because their master had sent them. Though it would seem that your boss or your neighbor or your wife or husband or mom or dad or ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or ex-wife or ex-husband, or they're all out to get you, you need to ask God to show you the bigger picture. When Paul wrote in Ephesians 6, he said, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in high places. Listen, let the Lord open your eyes to who's on your side, but may he also open your eyes to who your real enemy is. And I promise you, it is not the person you're looking at. Maybe you then will respond differently. Perhaps then you will learn to see people the way Jesus does. And perhaps then we will have the peace with our enemies when we learn to be kind to them, a kindness that is not deserved. Maybe for you today, maybe you need to open your eyes to all that God is doing to draw you into a relationship of peace with himself through his son Jesus. If you're not born again, today you can change that and no longer be an enemy of God, but a son or daughter. He wants to invite you to the dining table of the Lord. And right now your eyes are blinded to that, but if you will just allow the Lord to open them up and see that he has surrounded you with those that don't want to kill you, but who want to bless you, and you yield yourself, perhaps today at the close of service, you will pray with a pastor or a friend and give your life to Jesus and no longer be an enemy of God. Let's read on. Acts chapter 24, verse 1. Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, See that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity as being brought to this nation by your foresight. We accepted always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. Dishonest accolades are easy to lay upon the ears of those who do not fear looking in the mirror. I could go ahead and insert the names of contemporary politicians into this story. They would fit all too well as being undeserving of anything positive being said of them. But I will settle for telling you of Felix. Felix was the exact opposite type of leader described by Tertullus. He describes these flowery words, kind of a sort of a state of the union, that it's always peaceful and serene under the leadership of Felix. The exact opposite was more true. And never was there a more corrupt governor in office than Felix was. He advanced his own wealth and power by putting equally and more corrupted leaders into all areas of political office. Tertullus, however, was the master of flattery. He was perhaps the best-known lawyer of the region. And here he is pouring it on thick. Tertullus wants to flatter Felix and then get him to dispense with this issue regarding Paul quickly. You're noble, Felix. Paul and this matter, they're just insignificant. So here's my case. Rule in my favor and return to issues that are far more worthy of your valuable time and your great wisdom. This is what he says. And let's look now at Acts 24, verse 5. For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law, but the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, maintaining that these things were so. So now he turns his attention to Paul and the problems that Paul had caused. Tertullus was a self-righteous, arrogant, educated man and who constantly demeaned others, or the worth of others. And he says three things of Paul. He says, number one, Paul is a pest. He's a nuisance. Number two, he's an inciter of unrest and dissension among the Jews. And number three, if that isn't enough, he's a hick. He's a country bumpkin. This is what he's saying. Christians and the way were very common terms for the followers of Jesus by this time. Tertullus draws upon the term Nazarenes because Nazareth was a very small town and nothing significant ever happened or came from there. You might remember Nathanael. He was one of the 12 disciples when he was first brought to Jesus by Philip. Even he didn't think it was possible for a person of import to come from there. John chapter 1, verses 46 and 47, let me just read it to you. It says, And Nathanael said unto him, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Philip said, Come and see. Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said, Behold an Israelite, indeed in whom is no guile. You see, Nathanael said it like it was. Nazareth was a hick town. Nothing really came from Nazareth. And so now Tertullus is calling out on that whole thing. He claims Paul profaned their temple. He was attempting to let Felix know that it was a Jewish matter more than a Roman one. In other words, listen, this is a church issue. And although you do have the final say, let us deal with it. Or at least let us deal with it as we think, or at least you deal with it as we think it should be. Now, I'm recording this message on July 4th. I hope you realize that without the Judeo-Christian values of our founding fathers, the Constitution would look vastly different today. Perhaps more important, our Constitution is greatly weakened without a religious and moral people to govern it and carry out its precepts and concepts. John Adams said this, our second president, who succeeded Washington, said this, Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, Adams knew that unless we kept moral and religious principles, that the Constitution would not work. See, the question is not whether religion will have an influence upon the laws of any given land or people, The question really is, which religion will have that influence? Tertullus wanted Felix to allow the Jews and their religion to handle this issue, at least if not to handle it, to at least affect its outcome. In particular, he and his group wanted to judge Paul according to Jewish custom and in their own courts. Now, of course, those courts had completely become corrupt and totally void of justice. But he wanted to kind of flatter Felix and say nice things about him, and then let them just take it and handle it, and everybody would be happy. I love that joke about the guy who he's a very, very wealthy man. He's incredibly corrupt, and his brother dies, who was a gangster, a womanizer, just immoral man in every sense of the word. And so his living brother goes to the pastor and says, "Hey, would you do the funeral of my brother?" And the pastor says, "I can't do the funeral of your brother. He was corrupt of all. He was immoral. He was a terrible sinner. He dealt drugs. He did everything horrible, prostitution, everything." And the guy says, "I'll tell you what, I'll give your church $2 million if you'll say that my brother was a saint." The pastor thought, "Oh my goodness, $2 million. So he says, "I'll do the funeral." So he does the funeral, and he gets up there and he says, "I want you to know that John so-and-so here, that he was a deplorable human being. He died a horrible sinner. He was a womanizer, a pimp of prostitutes, a seller of drugs, and destroyer of families. He was the worst vermin of human beings. But compared to his living brother Steve here, John was a saint." I love that story. Well, that's really what's going on here. You know, the Roman centurion Lysias, he takes Paul into custody, and as he takes him into custody, he now delivers him to the courts, and this Tertullus is just throwing the flattery on to Felix to try to win him over so that he could, saying all the nice things so that he could indeed be the one who judges Paul. Now, let's go ahead and pick it up in verse 10 of chapter 24 and read on. "And then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, 'Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me.'" Paul chose to defend himself, but he is not going to lay flattery and flattery words on this corrupt man, like the guy did, the pastor did, telling the joke about, or not the joke, about what the pastor did with his